So here we are. I'm in Bridport. I've come to see Martin Maudsley.
You have.
And he's an ace storyteller.
You're very
well,
kind.
I think so anyway. And come to ask him a few questions. And the first one is, how did you get into storytelling, Martin?
Good question. My brother tells me that I told him, we shared bunks when we were kids, and I had the top bunk, being the oldest. And I would tell him stories from the top, although I'd forgotten that, and he has reminded me quite recently that I used to tell him stories from above to keep him entertained, or because he asked me, and I was quite happy to do that. So I guess I've always had a little bit of a buzz for storytelling. When I was at a university, I heard storytellers, got into that, sort of going to hear them, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. They're creating magic here. They're just sort of weaving a story out of thin air. So that went into my head. But it was later on, when I did environmental education, a little bit like yourself, sort of working outdoors with kids, that I found one particular moment in a forest with a group of children, quite tricky kids at the time, trying to get them to listen to me and to focus on what we're doing. I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to tell you a story. And I made up this story about the Vikings that used to live on this patch of woodland, and I could see all their faces going, wow, they're listening to me and they're paying attention, and I haven't been able to get them to do that all day. Yeah, what was happening? What is this thing? So, and then started to try and use it within environmental education more often, and eventually sort of got to love it so much that it's became pretty much what I do professionally, full time, or as much as professional is full time.
Yeah. Cool. So that's great. What do you think's magic about storytelling then? Can you put that in a minute answer?
It's hard, because in itself magic is hard to explain, but I think one thing is that when you're telling a story with an audience, there is this community that is formed. You know, there's something, we're all in it together. Suddenly we're all in it together. The storyteller, the listener, the story itself. And the classic way of explaining a story is that it happens in the space between the teller's lips and the listener's ears, and you're not quite sure what that person is hearing, but you know they're hearing something, and you know that they're reforming a story that has been in your brain, and it's now come through your mouth, and they're reconnecting with it. But while it's being told, I think we're all in it together, and sometimes you, as a storyteller, you feel yourself changing the story, or changing something, or the story changing within you. Maybe that's probably a better way of putting it. And I like that sense of, because it's not scripted in a proper sense, and it has the ability to be improvised and to be told, and to feed off what the audience are feeling and thinking, and sometimes directly suggesting. That I like that ability, but that being in a community of a story for the moment where the story is told. We were talking earlier that I do some storytelling in pubs in Bridport, and that's one of the things, because many people tell stories in pubs and people go to talk in pubs, but if you can tell a traditional story, a proper story, a whole story, that people just stop and they're all together. So normally in a pub, there's lots of stories being told, lots of conversations, but for the moment of that one story being told, we're all together in the pub, and I like that. Really. I think it's a special little piece of magic in that moment. So the being in the moment of the story is one way that I think is magic.
It is. Yeah, I can really agree with that. And so my particular interest is storytelling and nature connection, and how can stories help us connect to nature?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking, to link the last question to that question, I think when you do that kind of thing of creating a community outdoors, you've also got the community of the space as with you as well. And you've done this many times, when a crow comes past, and he's in the story. The trees make a kind of susurrating sound in the breeze, and suddenly you're constantly weaving that in. The kids are responding to it, and I think so. You're aware, you're being a bit more sensory when you're listening to stories outside, and that connects. And then to be a bit more formal about it, I think two things that I do in the process of telling stories is I do what's called story evidence, which is like I tell a story and then say, who can see the story, and suddenly once you've got the filter or the lens or the prism of a story in your imagination, you then look at the world. So one of the ways this happened to me, it was shown to me by a young person, a girl, that was listening to a story about a dragon. It ended in a dragon. The story ended with this dragon, and the dragon went off, and the girl just said, "And I know where the dragon lives." I said, "Yes, well, can you take me to it?" And sure enough, we went for a little walk, all her classmates with us, found this kind of trench into the ground with a few rocks around it, and it sure looked like a den for a dragon.
Yeah.
And she'd sort of seen, so then sometimes I then get them to sort of say, well, with the lens of a story, say we're doing giants or dragons, whatever it is, and then go and look, and then can you find a new story, so story evidence that builds up the next story or the new chapter in the same story. So I really like that way in which you blend observation and imagination. That's really like, when you can do that, because you can look at, the pieces of bark and they become dragon scales, and you're kind of, looking for sharp pieces of wood that are teeth. And dragon poo, of course, comes into it. Yeah, but just that super sensory way that you then go off into the world, and and so I like the way that connects with nature. I suppose the other side of it is that, and I don't really understand, maybe this is another piece of the magic, but somehow it holds a kind of a broad understanding of the way the world is, that it doesn't get too precise and trying to understand it, or it just holds the whole, I don't know, so how plants and animals are part of an ecosystem, and stories kind of show that interrelationships, and that kind of holds that deep truth in a good way, in an accessible way. So I like the fact that stories can teach us about the way the world works like that.
Yeah, me too. I love that. What one tip could you give a budding storyteller to help them?
I mean, think in the moment. Well, I do this thing with adults sometimes, but quite often with children. I call it Imagineering. And what I mean by that is to go into your imagination.
Story engineer.
Yeah, exactly. A story. Being an engineer in your own imagination. So to take a scene of a story. I've been working on some stories from Arabian Nights recently, and one of the stories is set in a sort of in a kitchen. So what I do is just really visualize that scene and that setting and the place where we are in the story as it takes place. So I then see the gleaming copper pans hanging on the iron racks. I see the flickering of the fire. I see this piece of meat spitting its juices and sizzling on the fire. I see a great chef with his corporate girth and his twiddly moustache, just kind of like going in, like if you see a picture and you see more and more detail, we'll try and do that in your head when you're telling a story, when you're setting a scene. Just go through and say, and who's in that scene? Is there there's a cat there in the story as well, and just trying to imagine the detail of a scene, and then allow yourself to tell it naturally and improvising it. And that process of turning a vivid imagination into a flow of words, I think that is a tip that can then help us to become better storytellers, to constantly be taking visual mental images into spoken words. And that's the building block really of storytelling.
And starting small with that.
And starting small, it could just be I mean, if sometimes you don't have to tell a whole story, you could just describe a story scene. Just an image, a little story image.
That can happen. Imagineering.
Imagineering, there you go.
There's our tip from Martin. And if people want to get hold of you, what's the best way?
My website would be lovely, and that's martinmaudsley.co.uk. And I think there's an email and a phone number on there. So have a look. Let me know what you think, if you've got any ideas, and get in touch if you need to.
It can be found in the pubs sometimes, telling stories in Bridport too.
Tonight, in fact.
Tonight?
We're going down to the pub. So if anybody's in Bridport, the first Thursday of the month we have a little story club in a pub called the Woodman in Bridport. So anybody local, Dorset, Devon, come and tell a story, do some Imagineering with us.
Excellent. Good. So as I came through the gate, you were just strumming your wonderful instrument. Would you give us a little strum?
A little strum.
With the sparrows,
if it's in tune,
the closing tune. There we go. You don't have to play a tune, but it's just.
It's not quite tuned.